Hi, welcome to another video of GeoSpinach. This is partially a continuation of the other video about the Russian perspective of the conflict. Now we're looking at the Ukrainian perspective of the conflict. This video will act independently of the other video, but I will recommend you to look at the previous video in the perspective of the Russian end goal of the war. Here with me, I have Anthony Haralambos. I am Andreas Panashis from the GeoSpinach channel, talking about current events, and specifically we're talking about Endgame. So how will this war end? When you play a game in geopolitics, any goals you have to have an end. You start a game in politics, and this will imply a Cold War that might lead to a hot war. As Clausewitz said, war is a continuation of politics, and this will imply that you have to have an end game. How do you end this war? So this is a general definition of the end game, and today we're going to talk about the end game of Ukraine.
Talking about end game, if we go back to Cyprus, the invasion in 1974, what would you describe the end game was for Cyprus back then?
So thank you, Anthony, for this. This is a continuation of the previous video we mentioned. As both of us, as Cypriots, we've both suffered a massive invasion to our land because of Turkey. And being realistic of the invasion, and unfortunately that was the event back in the 1960s and 70s, is because Cyprus then, and specifically Makarios, but Cyprus back then didn't have an end game when it came to geopolitics. We didn't have a scenario where the populace and the leadership of the people believed in an end of a conflict with Turkey, where that scenario will have included Turkey in Cyprus. So we automatically assumed that we either will unify with Greece, which was the ultimate dream of the Greek Cypriots, of our community, or that the Republic, as the way that it was had been built by the British, it will have somehow had worked. And the reason I'm putting a huge weight on the Cypriot conflict and the lack of an end game is a message to the Ukrainian people specifically. Don't be fooled by the objectives of other nations. Understand the consequences that your country will suffer. Today, Cyprus, 50 years after the invasion, the rest of the world doesn't give F about what's happening to our island. Doesn't care about the invasion, doesn't care the fact that 50% of the population lost their land. No one cares. No one punishes Turkey today for their invasion. Everyone has forgotten. Turkey has won. And that's the unrealistic, that's the reality that we don't want to accept, but they want the game. The main reason they want
I have another question though on the Turkish invasion. There was two phases of invasion. There was the 20th of July invasion and the 14th of August invasion, the first and second wave. Did the Turkish endgame change between the first and the second invasion?
Okay, great. So for Turkey, the end goal, when it came to Cyprus, I have a specific video on it on Greek. Eventually we'll make one in English. But for Turkey, the general end goal was to have a military base in Cyprus as to be able to protect its southern flank. So any deal will have concluded with Turkish troops on the island. That will either include Cyprus in NATO, with Turkey having a small base, or forcefully Turkey taking ground. So the first stage of the invasion was for them to achieve this goal. The main reason they went on for the second part of the invasion was due to the general failure of the Cypriot and the Greek armies to stop the Turkish onslaught. But the generally first plan of the invasion, they completely achieved their end game immediately. The problem with Cyprus, and we've seen that with the Atkinson plan of 1964, that both Turkey, Greece, and Britain and the US agreed upon, which is something quite rare to see those two countries to agree, is that Turkey would have gained 10% of the land as a military base on the island. Cyprus will have joined NATO, so we'll have Greek troops as well as American and German troops on the island. as to ensure the peace, because the UN is practically useless. And after 50 years, Turkey will have the right to continue holding that military base, but paying the Cypriot Republic, as well as abandoning all of their claims on the Turkish Cypriot population, which proportionally to the population is much lower than today's Russian population in Ukraine. So
that's interesting. I would disagree with you that the United Nations is totally useless. I mean, I believe it's a body that acts to prevent, and once the prevention fails, it's difficult sometimes to achieve meaningful change. However, there was many instances where the United Nations was successful in preventing wars. However, what I find interesting is that my understanding is that after the first wave of invasion, which Turkey was successful in getting Cypriot land, I think they received up to like 5% of land in Cyprus, which that is a decent military base in Cyprus, got more ambitious. And
yes, there was no resistance whatsoever. And you are right about the UN. I'm referring specifically to the UN in Cyprus. The UN in Cyprus was a massive failure, because on the 22nd and the 21st and the 22nd of July, so 2 days after the invasion, there were 5,000 to 10,000 UN troops based on the British military bases, and they were ordered to go and enforce a ceasefire, which they did not conduct their orders. So they did not do their duty, and they did so after the 16th of August, when Turkey had already conquered 38% of the land. So I was referring specifically to the failure of the UN on the island.
Yes. I just needed to specify that. I think this topic is very interesting, and it's something that should be discussed on this channel in English for your wider audience. However, I believe we're getting a bit off track from the Ukrainian questions. I think we should get back on track. And being as we are talking about Endgame, what is Zelensky's endgame of this war?
So before we argue what's Zelensky and Endgame, let's see what's happening right now in Ukraine. So Zelensky has received a lot of equipment from the West. He has trained 12 armored and mechanized brigades from the West, fully equipped with Western equipment and Western technologies. And this body has been the body of a counterattack. In my previous video on the Ukrainian war, I made the argument that the launching of the current offensive by Ukraine, which in militaristic terms is not considered a counteroffensive, since it's an offensive. Counteroffensive is an offensive on another person's offensive. Anyway, I made the argument that Ukraine shouldn't have launched the counteroffensive to begin with, mainly because it loses all of its political power if the offensive fails. 1 month later, we've seen that that offensive has practically failed. They've lost hundreds and hundreds of tanks of Western-made equipment. The amount of land gained is minimalistic. The Russians are using the tactics they didn't use in the start of the war, but now they are implementing the traditional Russian way of war tactics, Tukhachevsky, so deep defensive systems, which I have a video specifically on how a deep defensive system works and why is it successful against armor onslaught. And specifically, we've seen today exactly that scenario. Ukraine has expended the majority of its offensive capabilities, and it has practically lost its ability now to conduct a major offensive. Maybe I'm mistaken because we don't have all of the information. Maybe Ukraine will manage to break the line, though I do highly doubt it. But you can never be certain in war what's currently happening. But the offensive is gradually losing steam. Now, prior to the offensive, as we mentioned to the previous video, Russia was kind of open for discussions. It was sending kind of subliminal message to Ukraine, please, let's discuss it now so we can both declare victory. Today, a month later after the counteroffensive, with hundreds and hundreds of Ukrainian tanks lost, we've seen that Russia has changed tactics. It has stopped the grain deal. It has massively bombarded the Odessa and other exporting areas that previously had allowed Ukraine to export. and now it's moving to drag out the war as possible. But at the same time, I am of the strong belief that Putin, as we mentioned in the previous video, is willing to negotiate. The thing is with Zelensky, as Anthony, you have asked, what is Zelensky's end goal? So Zelensky is arguing, we're going to free all of our land. And that will imply not only Donbass, but that will also imply all of Crimea. So if you see my screen at the moment, so can you see my screen?
It should take a few. Yes, I can see.
Yeah, okay. So Zelensky wants all of his land bank, which I understand, we both understand as Cypriots, how does it feel and you want your land back. Both of us come from refugee families. Both of us, we've lost a lot of land. Like my family hasn't lost directly their houses, but they lost all of their ownership of land. They lost everything in the invasion. So I get the idea why you want your land back. But what Zelensky wants is to capture this territory. And let's assume that with some magical way, he can actually capture this territory back. So launches an offensive, it's able to use brilliant blitzkrieg tactics, completely annihilates the Russian army and takes his territory back. Will the war end?
That's a big question, isn't it?
So will Russia surrender? No. So let's say they take the land back. So is Russia going to surrender? Is Russia going to be, okay, I've lost the war. Okay, I'm surrendering. No, Russia cannot surrender. Russia as a player and the Russian populace, which is very similar to the Americans when it comes to their nationalism, but even worse, they cannot lose. And that's the mentality that the West can't understand. Losing this much territory will the only end game that's realistic is that because of the loss of this territory, Russia will fall into a massive civil war, thus being unable to continue the offensive in Ukraine, and probably the ones that wins that civil war will seek vengeance on Ukraine. The other possible scenarios is that if Russia does lose all of this territory, then it's guarantee that the ultranationalists will gain power. And if that happens, we are seeing a mass mobilization of Russian troops that they're going to attack continuously and unendlessly to finish the war, to gain as much territory as possible, to gain something to consider for them a victory.
So my understanding of this is basically the realistic endgame would be some sort of compromise for both
Yes.
Ukraine and the Russian state, because otherwise there is no way for this war to end. And the second scenario is a lot worse than having President Putin in power. We would have somebody much more nationalistic or populist,
ultra-nationalistic
in power, which, as we discussed in the previous video, they would probably try to gain a lot more land than what we are seeing now in Ukraine.
Exactly. So my main conclusion I want to give in regards to the concept of the end game when it comes to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict is the fact that the possibility that Ukraine takes that land and for some reason there's a change of government in Russia and that government is so weak that it's unable to launch a counteroffensive and accepts a peace, it's a very unlikely scenario. Even more unlikely if Ukraine is to join NATO. So this is a difference between the school of thoughts of geopolitics, between the liberalist school and the realism school. And what we are arguing here is in regards to the realism school, that, okay, it's nice to say you want your land back, but to be realistic here in regards to the people of Donbass and Crimea, Putin is right here that it was a gift by Khrushchev in the 1960s to Ukraine. If there is one peoples that can claim heritage from Crimea, that would be the Tartars, then the Russians, then the Cossacks, and then the Ukrainians. And similarly, that applies to the Donbas region, mainly because the Donbas region has been in an open rebellion since 2014. So even if they capture that land, the people living there, they don't want to be part of Ukraine. And it's something that us here in Cyprus had in all of our end games. We kind of forgot the factor, which is the Turkish Cypriot population. It's something you cannot ignore. It will always be your problem. You have to find a solution that either you like it or not will include Russia gaining something, because that's when it comes to the power balance of power.
Before we continue talking about what the Ukraine and Russia would have to compromise, you mentioned before Odessa, the area of Odessa that is still currently under Ukrainian control. The Security Council has been meeting for the Ukrainian war these days, and they have also mentioned that the disruption that Russia is by attacking the Odessa ports is causing a disruption to world economics as well. What is the effect between the Russian war, the Odessa port, and the West?
As I mentioned prior, attacking Odessa is sending a message to Ukraine: your counteroffensive has failed. Now we are going to try to starve you out. Is the idea that you lost this counteroffensive, we are going to launch an offensive. Probably our offensive will also fail, and you will launch an offensive again, and then we launch an offensive again. For how long do you think the West is going to support you?
That brings me to my next question: is will NATO and the European Union and the United Kingdom have been undoubtedly and unconditionally have been supporting this war, either through monetary means or military means by weapons? How long can we expect these three powers to continue supporting the Ukrainian war?
First of all, I'm not arguing that the West shouldn't have supported Ukraine. The West was good to support Ukraine. NATO had one original end goal, which was to weaken Russia and make Ukraine a gray zone. Mm-hmm. It had managed to achieve that marvelously through their colored revolutions. That's what those revolutions that happen in Ukraine, in Egypt, in Morocco, and all of this, they're called color revolutions. And the US always has its hand under all of these colorful revolutions. Nonetheless, the NATO has achieved its goal. So it has helped Ukraine to stop the Russian expansion. The territory that Russia has gained is minimalistic. And prior to the launching of the counteroffensive, only the fear of the potential Ukrainian counteroffensive was a great bargaining chip for the Ukraine, along with the West, to use it to negotiate with Russia for a favorable deal, a realistic favorable deal for Ukraine. Currently, with the kind of failure of the counteroffensive, with the massive failure of the counteroffensive, the Western population, specifically the European population, is starting to get a bit wary of all of this war, because we are suffering economically because of the war. We are energy depending on Russia. We are spending quite a lot of money on Ukraine. The liberal argument that we are supporting Ukraine because it's the right thing to do, I completely dismiss it. And sorry for this, but I don't see no German, Briton, and Frenchman and an American supporting the Cypriots currently with the Turkish occupation. Is literally 2 kilometers from here. They kind of forgot about that. And I don't see them bothering in Ethiopia or everywhere else in Africa. So the anthropistic, the human-centric argument of supporting the Ukrainian people because of freedom, low-key bullshit. I don't truly believe. I know that the European peoples and the Americans as peoples truly believe in those concepts, and this is why I consider myself as a Westerner, that the human life is the most worth thing. But to be realistic, the NATO as an alliance and the United States, the leader of NATO, doesn't give a flying shit. The reason they are doing it is to weaken Russia as much as possible. And after the failure of Afghanistan and Iraq, Ukraine is just another game they are playing, just throwing money there to grind as many Russians as possible. For us, how long? All of this money.
If we look at the United Kingdom, which has been, in my opinion, one of the most financially contributing countries from the continent of Europe to the Ukrainian war, I have lived in the UK for the past 4 years, and I have personally felt the economic effects that the UK has had, such as higher inflation, higher interest rates. However, what we have seen in this quarter, the UK has seemed to have fall in the inflation rate from almost around 11% to 7.9%. So inflation has fallen in the UK, which then the Bank of England has announced that the expected raises of interest rate to 5.5% at the national level will be delayed. Is that a safe assumption that we can make, that the UK will continue for the foreseeable future fund the Ukrainian war?
The UK will be the last country, probably, along with the United States, to financially support Ukraine. What I believe is that the majority of Western European countries will start stopping their support of Ukraine, followed by the Eastern European countries, and then eventually by the US and the UK. Specifically, up to this point, they were supplying Ukraine with their old equipment, especially Eastern European countries were supplying Ukraine with their old Soviet equipment, and all of those equipment were lost. And now they have supplied Ukraine with their new fancy equipment, which is, for now, they're really, really, really expensive. So they supplied Ukraine with Leopard 2s, and quite a lot of them, which are very expensive tanks. And for some reason, the Western media thought that because they supplied Leopard 2s, which are brilliant tanks, I'm not saying they're not brilliant tanks, they're majestic as vehicles, they are not magical in the sense they can win the war by themselves. And that is what exactly we have seen. They have not won, and they have lost thousands and thousands of those, hundreds and hundreds of those tanks. So for how long will the West purchase tanks such as this and give to Ukraine? I believe there's a limit. Now, I can't speculate to when will that limit be, but I know that there is a limit.
So assuming that there is a limit in the foreseeable future, and back to a realistic approach of the realistic endgame, is any time for Ukraine to get onto the negotiating table?
Well, as closing remarks, I will argue that a message from Cypriots to Ukraine, a message from a realistic geopolitical approach. Unfortunately, you should strive towards a peace now. If Putin comes and loses power, the chance for you to be able to negotiate any favorable deal towards you will massively decrease. So now it's the opportunity to make a deal, now that Putin is weakened as a political power within Russia. Because as the war progresses, Ukraine will get more and more into debt. The human casualties will rise astronomically. Nationalism, fanatism, and radical ideologies, both in Russia and in Ukraine, will rise to astronomical levels. The brutality of the war will move to a whole new level, and the most probably outcome is that there is no change on the battlefield, or even Russia gaining more land. So what we are expecting right now is that Ukraine is not going to go into negotiation tables. We're expecting Russia to launch their own counteroffensive to the Ukrainians' counteroffensive. Most probably, we can never be sure of that. Maybe they're not ready for it. They will probably not gain much of a ground, but they will probably launch their offensive. And then we're just going to follow up this stalemate. We cannot know, so inherently war is unpredictable, but any country being in a state of war continuously is not something favorable. So my main argument is that Ukraine, and especially the West, should start pushing Ukraine into a deal. So tell Ukraine, okay, continue fighting the war. I'm going to continue giving you these weapons, but you should start negotiating a peace. And we're going to support you in this peace, but you should start negotiating peace.
Yeah, my understanding is if we look at the after effects of the 1974 war in Cyprus, is that once you lose the war, it's almost impossible to gain peace through the negotiating table. It's been 49 years since Cyprus has been occupied, with countless attempts of
peace negotiations
of reuniting our country that have fallen to deaf ears. Obviously,
and let us clarify. The war in Cyprus.
My biggest dream is to see Cyprus united. Let me specify that.
Yeah, we both support this. Let's specify that the fact that Cyprus, in theory, is still currently in a ceasefire. It's like,
yes,
the war hasn't actually ended. We are in a ceasefire. Both me and Anthony were both soldiers of the Cypriot National Guard. Like, Cyprus is continuously in a state of war. It's not like we are fighting the Turks, but we are always in the mindset that the war will reignite. This is not how you want your country to live. So thank you, Anthony, for this video. This has been the end in regards to the Russian-Ukrainian understanding of an endgame. Thanks again, guys, for watching. Please like and subscribe. And
thank you for everybody for watching, and thank you, Andres, for having me on this second part of the podcast. I hope to see you soon.
See you guys, and see you, Anthony.